Walnut Gulch is in a semi-arid region in southeastern Arizona, and Tombstone, the city of Tombstone, is right in the center of the watershed. The Walnut Gulch Experimental Watershed is really our outdoor laboratory. That's where we collect data, we do experiments, and we understand, or try to understand, and gain knowledge about how water comes through the system into a watershed, infiltrates, runs off, changes its chemical composition by erosion or picking up nutrients. Walnut Gulch, and rightly so, is the most densely instrumented experimental watershed in the world in terms of arid and semi-arid context for something its size. And that includes runoff measurement instrumentation, soil moisture, sediment, erosion instrumentation. We now have about 90 recording rain gauges, and they're recording at a 1-minute interval in a 60 square mile region. And you don't find that density of rain gauge measurements anywhere else in the world. Walnut Gulch is a tributary to the San Pedro River, which drains to the Gila and eventually to the Colorado River. Most of the runoff is generated by these intense thunderstorms. The watershed was selected to be representative of a very large area of rangelands in the basin and range topography in the west. In Walnut Gulch itself, we have a transition between a desert shrubland in the lower portion of the watershed and grasslands in the upper portion of the watershed. So it encompasses that transition so we can study both sides of it. Data, hydrologic, meteorological data, has been collected at the Walnut Gulch Experimental Watershed for 60 years in a continuous fashion. And that's really important when we have a changing and dynamic world with things like population change, climate change, water use change, and land use change. We need to understand how land management and conservation practices either help or hurt water flow and erosion.
The data logging capabilities that we have now with the new electronic digital rain gauges allows us to expand the number of sensors we have in a site. So we have soil moisture, we might have soil moisture at multiple depths. We might have an IRT, an infrared thermometer measuring the soil surface temperature. It's not just a rain gauge, but it's a rain gauge with a suite of sensors that can be attached to it.
Since runoff is one of the principal components of the hydrologic cycle, we're measuring that runoff and sediment erosion through this flume. This supercritical flume is able to measure with depth the amount of cubic feet of water that go through the flume, and that is recorded as digital data also. The data is telemetered by radio with an antenna to our base station.
This is one of the few places in the earth where we can really quantify both the amount of water coming in, physically from precipitation of the watershed and the amount that's going out. Land and atmosphere communicate by exchanging energy and water and carbon dioxide. At our flux tower, that's what's really allowing us to measure those vertical exchanges of water, carbon, and energy. What's really neat about this work is that as we go forward, we know the climate is changing and is changing rapidly. We have that rich data set that goes into the past that allows us to understand in what context that we've collected the last 10 years of data from our flux towers. So now we can move forward and see what's going to happen in the next decade. Was this just a unique period, or yeah, this really is representing a new normal in climate, and we'll be there to monitor how the ecosystem responds to that.
Southwest is a rapidly growing area, and we've got all of this infrastructure to put in, but we still have to worry about storm runoff. So when developers or the city puts in a culvert or a bridge, they need to know how big the culvert should be. A lot of the basic data that was developed at Walnut Gulch was used to help provide guidelines to size bridges, to size culverts, and the data from this watershed has helped people design the sizing of those things so you don't have flooding problems. The health of rangelands is often measured by how much erosion they can withstand and still be healthy, productive environments. Our models will allow you to say how much erosion you can expect with various climates and various covers, and that's used to deploy conservation practices all over the country.
Rainfall simulation experiments were started before World War II, actually in Tucson. And for our unit, we've been doing it since the 60s. Basically, what we're trying to do is simulate what happens under natural conditions when there's rainfall and runoff and erosion. So we have a device that simulates rainfall, the characteristics of rainfall, and we measure the amount of runoff and erosion, and then measure other characteristics of the plot like canopy cover, like ground cover, bare soil, amount of rock, amount of basal cover.
Quantifying the vegetation gives you an idea of how exposed the soil would be to potential erosion. So the less cover you have, then the more likely you are to lose your soil to erosion.
The reason that we like to do simulations of Walnut Gulch is we have a lot of rainfall data, a lot of watershed data that we can relate the specific data we take there with those data.
One of the primary research objectives of our research center is to understand what factors that characterize the watershed impact the amount of erosion that we're able to measure. We measure sediment during individual flow events by taking samples of water and sediment during the flow as the runoff's coming through a flume. When we get that sample, we can figure out the concentration of the sediment, and then we can do a calculation to figure out the total amount of sediment that came through with that flow. There are 22 stock tanks on the watershed, and at this particular spot, what we have is a standpipe and a float and a recorder that monitors the water depth. When we convert that water depth to a volume by measuring the surface of the pond when it's dry, before and after the runoff comes into it. And we difference those surface models, and the difference in those models we attribute to sediment accumulation, and we can calculate what the volume of that accumulation was. So what we end up with is an annual measure of the sediment that was delivered from the watershed as a whole to this downstream control point. And then what we can do with that information is compare and contrast across the different monitoring sites on the watershed, so we can look at what the effect of variations in geology or vegetation type. Has a development gone in on the area? Have new roads been introduced on the area? If something has changed on that watershed such that the amount of sediment we measure is noticeable, then we might be able to attribute the causal factors to that as a driver to that change.
Not only is the experimental watershed our outdoor laboratory, it's an outdoor laboratory for all of our collaborators. And we've had people literally from all over the world come for experiments in Walnut Gulch because they not only don't have the resources, but don't have the historical context and knowledge that we have about Walnut Gulch.
Walnut Gulch really is kind of the mecca for rainfall, runoff, erosion process data in the world. People use this data around the world to calibrate their models to better understand what's going on in their region.
If a scientist from another agency, say NASA or the University of Maryland, wants to put out an albedo meter here, they don't have to supply all their infrastructure. They can just send the sensors, give us instructions, we can wire them in and start recording data. And again, those data are transmitted by the radio telemetry every night at midnight. Those data stream into either Tucson or Tombstone, and we can make that data available to researchers around the world, literally, in a matter of hours.
Because of our long-term collaboration with NASA and other European Space Agency for that matter, we have one of the largest collections of both satellite imagery, aircraft imagery, and associated support ground data for that imagery of any place in the world.
Surprisingly, a lot of the research that we do at Walnut Gulch is done with satellites that are orbiting hundreds of miles above Walnut Gulch. By monitoring these satellite images, which have been collected for almost 30 years, you can see if the season is starting earlier or later than it was the year before. You can see how large storms are affecting it versus prolonged drought. Satellites are also used for determining runoff, recharge, floods, anything having to do with hydrology. This work is particularly suitable for Walnut Gulch because Walnut Gulch has, again, a 60-year record of measurements of soil moisture, erosion, plant productivity, no less precipitation, and air temperature, all this information. So the question is, how do we scale up the research at Walnut Gulch to these other areas around the world in China, Australia, Africa? NASA and other groups launch satellites, and they hope that they'll be used for resource management and for real-life applications. The problem is that they don't know how the satellite measurement relates to what's going on the ground. So what we do at Walnut Gulch is we try to derive important information from the satellite data, and that way, once we've made that connection, someone else could use the satellite data at their location and understand what's going on at their location without having that grand data set that Walnut Gulch has. Research generally requires a context, and Walnut Gulch has a time context and a space context that allows us to do research that's very unique.
We're in a position to really try to document not only land cover and population changes, but climate change as it affects hydrology. You know, we can't take a year off in terms of these long-term records. If a rare event occurs that might sort of reset the watershed in the system, if we miss that event, we may not be able to explain what's going on in the future. So it's really essential that we maintain the continuity so we don't have to guess at what may have happened. We've got an increasing population. A disproportionate amount of that population in the U.S. is moving to semi-arid regions. And that means water is going to be all the more important, not only to sustain those people, but the food and the energy that they need as well. It's my opinion that in this budgetary environment, a place like Walnut Gulch is not going to be replicated. And the fact that we have all the historical context and all of these issues that are being faced in semi-arid regions aren't going away makes it critical that we continue its operation to better understand water in these environments.